My son-in-law tried to guilt me into gifting him my lakefront property. Wouldn't it make sense, he continued, to pass it down now? Let the next generation start making memories there. My stomach clenched. The nerve of him, to talk about my cabin like it was some timeshare he was owed. I looked at Elise, hoping for some flicker of protest, some sign that she'd step in and remind him whose name was on that deed. But she just sipped her water and stayed quiet. That silence cut deeper than Mark's words ever could. I gave a small, polite laugh, the kind that says, "I heard you, and that's the last time you'll say that in front of me." But it wasn't. A week later, Elise called to check in, and somehow the conversation veered back to the cabin. "You know, Mark just wants what's best for the kids," she said gently. "It's such a special place, Dad. Don't you want your grandkids to grow up with the same memories?" Memories, I thought bitterly. They weren't trying to preserve them. They were trying to own them. Mark saw the lakefront and smelled money. Elise saw her husband's ambition and mistook it for legacy. But neither of them saw the ghosts I lived with every time I stepped into that cabin. Neither of them had patched the roof during a thunderstorm or held Marianne's hand in front of that fireplace when she told me the chemo wasn't working. A week later, I stood alone at the edge of the dock, the morning sun splitting across the water like gold. I tried to imagine someone else in my bedroom, someone else's kids racing through the hallway, someone else deciding which walls to knock down or what color to paint the kitchen. The thought made me nauseous. That wasn't a place you took over. That was a place you earned. I knew then what I had to do. I didn't know how it would go over. I didn't know what it would cost. But I wasn't going to be bullied into giving up the last thing in this world that felt like home. I would rather set it on fire than see it gutted by someone who saw it as nothing more than real estate. And that's when the idea started to form. Not revenge, not spite, but something quieter, something rooted in dignity. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to choose. Because legacy isn't about blood. It's about respect. And Mark, for all his charm and calculation, hadn't earned a single inch of that land. But I knew someone who had. Someone who still remembered how cold the water was that first summer, and who never once asked me for anything other than a second helping of marshmallows by the fire. I had been waiting for a calm day to unravel that knot in my chest, the way I'd once waited for the perfect cast when teaching my oldest to fish. So I decided to invite the family over for what felt like a simple afternoon. Burgers on the grill, old stories, a fire later by the water's edge. I remembered how Marian used to stand beside me, laughter tinkling like chimes whenever a kid caught their first fish. I imagined we might reclaim a sliver of that peace. I woke up before dawn the morning of the gathering, setting out folding chairs around the picnic table under the pine boughs where the sun dappled through with lazy warmth. I laid their favorite potato salad in a bowl we'd hand-mixed for years, and I lit the coals early so the charcoal wouldn't stall when everyone arrived. My heart felt heavy with hope and dread in equal measure. The dread because of Mark's quiet insistence that it was just time. The hope for a simple gathering where old love might outshine new expectations. I thought maybe if we all just sat on the old dock, watched the ripples, we could find our center again. They arrived just before lunchtime, my daughter Elise, holding her youngest's hand, and Mark, who wore that polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. The grandchildren ran ahead, children I'd pushed from the dock during cold mornings, teaching them I was there even when the water licked their ankles with chill. The air smelled like summer and cut grass, and for a moment, I felt anchored to all of that. We exchanged pleasantries. I set plates, and the kids dug in. But I noticed the way Mark surveyed the cabin, like he was appraising a future renovation, not a childhood memory. He asked about structural repairs, about the roof, about the plumbing's age. Elise didn't interrupt him. Marcus and little Jenny squealed about water games, oblivious to the tension. I tried to steer conversation toward lighter territory, how the wild blueberries were flourishing, how the boat needed a new rope, but Mark circled back, complimenting the place only to follow with, "You know, it'd shine once we modernized it." That comment landed hollow, and no one seemed to notice except me. The day drifted on, too full of small silences, the kind that echo louder than shouts. I watched Mark laugh at his own jokes, feeling a tightness in my chest where I should have felt warmth. When the kids begged to swim, I let them, always within arm's reach. everything within reach, except what I really needed. After the meal, someone suggested making a fire by the shore. The old fire pit still sat worn and soot-black from decades of storytelling, marshmallow roasting nights. As the sun leaned down, we gathered around. The kids danced around the flames, swinging sticks with marshmallows while their parents talked about seasonal rentals, investment return, the cabin's potential. The words felt like stones landing in a waterfall, weightless but relentless. Elise stayed quiet, her eyes flicking to me only when I looked at her. I realized then that the hurt I felt wasn't just from Mark's talk, but from Elise's silence, the unease of a daughter who wouldn't stand sentinel beside the legacy of her mother and me. I wanted to speak, to shout that this place wasn't for sale, that memories don't come with a price tag. But the words lodged in my throat behind pride. Maybe I had already lost her, or maybe I was the one withdrawing. The fire crackled between us, mirroring the spark of old days and the heat of unspoken conflict. Later, as stars blinked awake above us, I offered to take the kids for one last walk to the dock. I could have used the solitude to steady my resolve, to chase away the ache of betrayal. Under the indigo canopy, I bent to check their bobbing toes on the dock's edge. I felt small, the breeze shaping a whisper around me. You built this place, and you know what it held. When I stood, Mark's voice came floating across the water, measured, sweet. Dad, Elise and I were wondering. I turned slowly, inhale catching when I saw them walking toward me, Elise behind him. Mark held papers in one hand, a folder in the other. There was something in his step, the calculated calm of a man who already knew he should have something, and wanted it. My heart hammered. Elise's cheeks were pale, lips pressed tight. The kids tumbled off the dock before me, shrieking with laughter as they raced toward their mother. I swallowed, my throat dry, hands shaking a little. Mark slipped the papers onto the dock between us. What felt like the weight of entitlement. He began, in that quiet tone, about how I'd worked so hard, how the cabin should pass to the next generation before it fell into disrepair, how the family owed it to themselves. Elise stood beside him, silent, nodding once. I looked at the papers, words typed professionally, deed, transfer, signature. In that moment, years of campfire smoke, laughter, tears, and quiet nights seemed to hang in the air, asking me if I would let it vanish. I looked at Mark's face, smooth and confident, and then I looked at Elise, who wouldn't meet my eyes, who leaned just enough into him that I felt the warmth of her love for him blocking me out. My voice came out low. I see. I did not argue it. I did not want to. I told them to leave. I held the papers in my hand, a trap and a challenge. They hesitated a second, then turned, the mailman of my loss. The stars blinked knowingly, and the night seemed to close in as I counted the footsteps going away. I stayed a moment longer on the dock after they left, cold creeping into my bones. The water lapped softly, reminding me of summers past. I held onto the papers, but let them sink to the weathered wood beneath my feet. And for all that echoes between two hearts, the simple sound of a family walking away felt like a fracture in the world. I stayed there on the dock until the embers died, feeling the ache of betrayal twist around every memory, every plank underfoot. The laughter of my grandchildren still echoed, their joy untouched, but the love behind it felt distant. That night, the cabin held ghosts of warmth and heartbreak in equal measure, and I understood that gathering would be remembered not for the meal or the laughter, but for the moment when everything changed. I thought I had made myself clear that night on the dock, but clarity is a funny thing in families. It's like fog. Sometimes you believe you've seen all there is to see, only to find that someone else was squinting through their own version of it. I spent the next few days in a kind of stunned quiet, walking the rooms of my house as if it had grown larger in their absence. My mind kept circling back to Elise's eyes, not angry, not apologetic, just empty. That emptiness unsettled me more than Mark's gall. I could almost stomach his entitlement. After all, ambition has its own blindfold. But Elise, my daughter, who once ran through this very yard barefoot, hair tangled with lake wind, her silence sat heavy on my chest like wet denim. It wasn't just what she didn't say. It was what she allowed him to say on her behalf. The things she let him assume were his to claim. 3 days later, just as I had settled into the illusion that maybe they'd drop it, that perhaps embarrassment would carry more weight than greed, they showed up again. I saw their car, Mark's leased SUV, ease up the gravel driveway with that same polished confidence he wore like a second skin. Elise was in the passenger seat, shoulders tight. I watched from the window for a few moments, hoping, naively, that they were here to apologize, or at the very least, reconsider. But then I saw the folder again. Not the same one from the dock, but a thicker one this time, with tabs and dividers. I knew that kind of paperwork. Not a suggestion, an arrangement. Mark stepped out first, brushing non-existent lint from his sleeve like he was preparing for a business meeting. Elise followed slower, her hands knotted together like she was holding something fragile inside and praying it didn't break. I opened the door before they could knock. I didn't want that sound echoing through my home. Felt like it would hurt more than it should. "Come in," I said, already regretting it. They stepped into the living room, and the air shifted like it always does when someone walks in not for comfort, but conquest. Mark took the liberty of sitting, placing the folder neatly on the coffee table like an offering he expected me to bless. Elise stood. Her eyes flicked around the room as if every picture frame on the walls accused her, and maybe they did. Photos of Marianne holding Elise at the lake, birthdays on the dock, Christmas mornings in this very room. All of it hers, and yet somehow not. Mark leaned forward, hands folded like a man selling insurance. "Frank, we thought about what you said," he began, with that damnable calmness. "And we really feel like we should revisit this. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to secure the future, for the kids, for Elise, for the family legacy." He opened the folder, revealing drafts of legal transfers, highlighted clauses, even tax benefit estimates. "You've done so much. You deserve rest, freedom. Let us take this burden off your shoulders." I didn't answer. I walked to the hallway and returned with an old photograph. Me, Marianne, and Elise at the cabin, when Elise was no older than 5. Her face was smeared with marshmallow, her hair wet from the lake. We were all laughing. I laid the photo next to his folder. "That place," I said quietly, "is not a burden. It's the last piece of her I've got." Mark exhaled slowly, frustrated but trying to hide it. "And I respect that, I do. But that's the past, Frank. We're talking about the future. You can't live in memories forever. Wouldn't Marianne have wanted you to share this with the kids? To let them grow up in it, like Elise did?" That was the moment I felt the fire rise in me. Not a rage, but something deeper. A severing. "You don't get to say what Marianne would have wanted," I said, my voice low but firm. "You weren't there when she sanded the porch rails until her hands blistered. You didn't see her cry when we finally got running water installed. That cabin isn't a real estate asset. It's a graveyard of our effort and our love. And if you think you can wear a suit and call that history yours, then you don't understand family at all." Elise finally spoke then, so softly I almost didn't hear her. "Dad, we just want what's fair." I turned to her, and for a moment, I was speaking only to her, not to the man beside her. "Fair?" I asked. "Where were you last winter when the pipes burst and I spent Christmas Eve under the floorboards? Where were you in spring when I asked you to bring the kids up and you said you were too busy with work? You didn't want that cabin then. You want it now because Mark sees something shiny in it, and you're letting him convince you that it's love." Her face crumbled, just a little. A crack in the porcelain. But she didn't step away from him. She didn't refute a word he said. Mark stood, closing the folder with finality. "You're making a mistake, Frank." "No," I said, standing too, taller than I had in years. "I made a mistake thinking you were family. You're my daughter's husband, Mark. But you're not my son, and I don't owe you a damn thing." He stared at me for a moment too long, then turned to Elise. "We're going," he muttered. She looked at me one last time before following him out, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Remorse, maybe, or resignation. It didn't matter. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt like winter. I stood in that silence, my chest heaving like I'd just run a mile, though I hadn't moved. I looked down at the photo still sitting on the coffee table. I picked it up, traced Marianne's smile with my thumb, and whispered to the room, "They don't get to erase us." That night, I sat in my kitchen with the lights off, the photo still in hand. And I realized something painful but true. Sometimes, the people you love the most become strangers in pursuit of things you never thought they'd value more than you. But I wasn't going to let my life story end as a footnote in someone else's ambition. Not now. Not ever. The silence after their departure was brutal in its finality. For days, I didn't hear a word. No calls, no texts, not even the half-hearted messages that come out of obligation. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't settle over a house, but claws at it, like ivy curling in through the cracks. I wandered from room to room, not aimlessly, but with a restlessness that kept my spine stiff and my jaw tight. I couldn't stop picturing Elise's face, how she stood next to Mark like an accessory to her own betrayal. And the worst part? I kept wondering if I'd raised her wrong. If something in the way I taught her strength had somehow turned into this submission to someone else's ambition. But that path was poison. I couldn't walk it too long without losing myself. One afternoon, I pulled out an old photo album from the cabinet beneath the record player, something Marion used to leaf through with Elise when the world still felt full of soft edges. Among the usual snapshots of birthdays and fishing trips was one photo I hadn't looked at in years, a young Sam, all gangly limbs and untamed curls, helping me stain the cabin deck. He was barely 15 then, all elbows and eagerness. He'd shown up that summer without being asked, just wanting to help after Marion passed. No speeches, no promises, just a kid with calloused palms and a quiet understanding of grief. I remember thinking then, if I ever had a son, I'd want him to be like this. I picked up the phone before I could talk myself out of it and dialed his number. When Sam answered, there was a warmth in his voice I hadn't realized I missed. "Uncle Frank," he said immediately. "You okay?" Not "how are you?" Not "what's going on?" Just "you okay?" That simple concern landed deeper than he probably knew. I told him everything. Maybe not in the perfect order, maybe more with sighs and half sentences than clear explanations. But Sam listened, never once interrupted. When I told him what Mark had said about the cabin, how it was better suited in younger hands, how it was a family asset, he let out a sharp breath that made it clear he didn't agree. "That place is sacred," he said, his voice steady. "It made me who I am. I wouldn't touch it without your say-so. You know that, right?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That moment, hearing that kind of reverence, that respect, it cracked something open in me. I realized that respect wasn't something you could demand or inherit. It had to be built. And Sam, in his quiet way, had been building it with me all these years. We made plans to meet that weekend, not at the cabin, but here at my house. I wanted to see him face to face, hand him a key if I felt it in my bones. But fate, as it often does, had other ideas. The voicemail came the next evening. I was out in the garage, sharpening a chisel for a woodworking project I didn't have the heart to begin, when my phone buzzed on the shelf. One missed call. From Elise. For a split second, my heart lifted. A flash of hope I immediately regretted. I opened the message and hit play. Her voice, softer than I remembered, came through the speaker with a bitter edge I hadn't expected. "Dad, I don't even know what to say anymore. I don't know why you're doing this. Mark's just trying to take care of the family. He sees value in what you built, not just sentimentality. And you keep pushing us away like we're thieves. Do you even care what this is doing to the kids? They miss you. I miss you. But you're making it really hard to be on your side right now." I played it twice. Not because I didn't understand the words. I understood them all too well. But because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining the entitlement buried beneath the guilt. It wasn't an apology. It was a reprimand. A way of twisting my resistance into selfishness. I set the phone down and sat on the workbench, the metal edge biting into my thigh. My hands curled into fists without me noticing. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that they hadn't come to share a legacy, they'd come to claim it. And when I didn't hand it over, they turned the tables, tried to paint me as the one breaking the family apart. But respect doesn't come with threats. And love, real love, doesn't come with paperwork. When Sam arrived the next morning, he brought coffee and a box of donuts, the same way he used to back when I'd teach him how to patch drywall. He sat at my kitchen table, glanced around the room, and said, "Looks the same." I chuckled. "Feels a lot different." We didn't jump right into it. We talked about work, about his kids, about how his oldest had just started Little League and hated the helmet. But eventually, I pulled out the manila envelope with the deed inside. His eyes widened, then immediately softened. "Uncle Frank," he said, "you don't have to." I cut him off. "I know I don't. That's why I'm doing it." I told him about the voicemail, about the silence, about the way I had begun to feel like a guest in my own bloodline. He listened, nodding slowly, like someone absorbing not just the words, but the weight behind them. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It's about making sure this place goes to someone who understands what it means, not someone who sees dollar signs and granite countertops." Sam looked down, cleared his throat. "I'll take care of it. I swear. I won't change a thing unless you say it's okay. I'll bring the kids every summer. We'll fix what needs fixing and leave the rest the way it is." I slid the envelope across the table. "I know you will." As Sam left, holding the deed like it was something sacred, I stood at the doorway and watched him disappear down the gravel road. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel regret. What I felt, for the first time in weeks, was relief. Because I hadn't just passed on property, I'd passed on a promise. And I knew, without a doubt, it was in the right hands. The peace didn't last. I should have known it wouldn't. Nothing that quiet ever stays undisturbed, not when pride's been wounded and entitlement denied. It started with a text, just one, that popped up 2 mornings after I handed Sam the deed. A neighbor, Judith from down the road, messaged me a screenshot of a post from the local community group. The caption read, "When legacy is stolen by bitterness, what happens when a father forgets who family really is?" Underneath was a blurry photo of my cabin from what looked like last summer, kids playing near the dock. And beneath that, hundreds of comments. Some were vague, others sharply judgmental. Words like cruel, disrespectful, and cutting your daughter out ran through the thread like a bloodline of its own. I read them slowly, not out of shock, but with a kind of numb awareness. This was Mark's doing. Elise didn't post it, but she let it happen. That, somehow, felt worse. I didn't comment, didn't defend myself. I didn't run to the phone or try to rewrite their version of the story. Instead, I poured myself a mug of coffee, walked out to the porch, and let the morning sun touch my face. But the heat didn't chase away the ache growing in my chest. That cabin wasn't just land. It wasn't a prize to be fought over in the court of public opinion. It was where Mary Ann and I dreamed out loud, where our children carved their names into trees. To watch it reduced to social media gossip and reputation politics, well, it broke something in me I hadn't realized was still intact. I had known they'd be angry. I hadn't expected them to make me the villain in the story I built with my bare hands. Later that day, Mark showed up again. Not Elise. Just him. His SUV screeched into my driveway like a warning. I was already on the porch when he stepped out, sleeves rolled up, phone in hand, eyes full of rage dressed in politeness. "You didn't even give her a chance to speak," he said before he reached the steps. I didn't move. "She had every chance," I answered. "She chose not to take it." He came closer. "You blindsided her, signing over the deed to someone else. Someone not even your child? That's cruel. That's deliberate." I stood then. Not fast, not dramatic. Just enough to remind him whose porch he was standing on. "It was deliberate," I said. "Because your version of family comes with a price tag. Mine comes with memories. And you don't get to rewrite that." His nostrils flared. He shook his head, smiling bitterly. "Everyone sees what you did. You think people are siding with you? You've got this martyr complex like the world owes you something because you swung a hammer 40 years ago. Get over yourself. It's not about you anymore." I took a step down toward him, now eye to eye. It's always been about family. Not profit. Not image. And if you'd ever actually spent a night in that cabin without planning renovations in your head, you might have known that. He scoffed, stepped back, muttered something under his breath, and turned to leave. "You'll die alone in that empty house, Frank. I hope you enjoy your victory." I didn't reply. I waited until the engine faded before going inside. Not because I was shaken, but because I realized something that hit harder than anger ever could. He didn't understand legacy. He only understood leverage. That evening, I got a call from Elisa's mother-in-law, Teresa, a woman I'd barely spoken to outside of birthdays and holidays. Her voice was cold, controlled. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Frank," she began. But whatever feud you've got with Mark and Elise, dragging the children into it is shameful. I laughed once. Dragging them in? You think I posted anything? That I told the world to pick sides? She didn't hesitate. You made a choice that alienated your only daughter. Do you think that won't have consequences? I told her then, clear and without apology. The only consequence I care about is whether or not I can still look in the mirror and know I protected what mattered. And I can. She hung up before I finished. I stood in the kitchen, the dial tone still humming in my ear, and realized this wasn't just a fallout. It was a purge. The kind that reveals who believes in bloodlines and who believes in boundaries. Sam called later, nervous. Did I make this worse for you? He asked. I heard the guilt, felt it through the line. No, I said. You didn't make this worse. You helped me draw the line. There's a difference. He offered to delay any visits to the cabin to keep things quiet. I told him no. You take the kids. You light a fire. You fish. You remember her. He went quiet. Her meaning Marianne. Meaning the reason that cabin still breathed. I will, he promised. Every summer. Just like you would have. The next morning, the mail came. A padded envelope addressed in Elise's handwriting. Inside, a framed photo of the kids. No note. No return address. Just the picture. I held it like it might break, studying their smiles. Happy. Unaware. I placed it on the mantel next to Marianne's favorite ceramic duck. I didn't cry. Not then. But I felt something shift, an ache deep in the marrow. Regret and resolve, twisting in tandem. I whispered to the photo, I hope someday you understand why I did it. Why I had to. That night, I stood on the back porch under a bruised sky, the world dimming around me, and I knew one thing for certain. Choosing peace doesn't always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels like fire. But I'd rather burn with my truth than be kept warm by someone else's lies. The first time I returned to the cabin after everything, I didn't drive. I walked the last half mile, cutting through the trail behind the ridge the way I used to when the kids were small and impatient. It was quieter that way, more honest. The trees hadn't changed much. The pines still leaned into one another like old friends, and the dirt still crunched with that same dry rhythm beneath my boots. The air smelled like ash and bark and something older than either of them. Like time itself had decided to linger here longer than it should. I moved slowly, deliberately, like the place might vanish if I startled it. But it didn't. The cabin was there, standing solid against the waterline, as if waiting for me to come home and explain myself. Sam had done good work. The place was clean, cared for. No renovations. Just preservation. The kind that honors rather than erases. The wind moved through the porch rafters, and I could almost hear Marianne's voice humming under it. That low, absent-minded melody she used to sing while brewing morning coffee. I stood on the dock and looked out at the lake, watching a ripple pass without cause, as if stirred by a ghost. I thought of Elise then, not with anger, not even grief, but with something closer to understanding. I knew now that part of growing old is realizing that even those you raised don't always grow into people you recognize. But it doesn't mean they stopped being yours. It just means the version of them you miss might not come back. And maybe that's the part that hurts the most. I stayed out there for hours, not because I had anything left to do, but because I needed to remember why I said no. Why I let the bridge burn. People always talk about boundaries like they're fences, simple things you set up and forget. But real boundaries? They're fire lines. They cost you. They scare people. They get misunderstood. And sometimes, they make you look like the villain in someone else's version of the story. But I realized that day, standing on the edge of the dock, that I'd rather be misunderstood than manipulated. I didn't need to be anyone's hero. I just needed to be at peace with myself. That was the only inheritance I still had control over. Back at the house, the photo Elise sent still sat on the mantel. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. The kids were smiling, genuine, full. And something about that photo told me they didn't know. Not really. Not the version of the story being spun in Facebook threads or whispered during brunches. They just knew their grandpa had a place they used to love and that, somehow, it was gone from them now. That night, I almost called Elise. I almost dialed her number and told her I missed her voice. That I remembered the way she used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms and how she called the cabin Mom's Lake. But I didn't. Because love doesn't erase boundaries. It just sits beside them, quiet and waiting. And I wasn't ready to lower the line. Instead, I wrote her a letter. Not to send, just to write. I told her everything. About the pain, the fear, the aching sense of being replaced by convenience. I told her I forgave her, not because she asked, but because carrying that weight any longer felt like dragging chains through every memory we ever made. I tucked the letter into a book Marianne once read aloud to Elise and placed it back on the shelf. Maybe someday she'd find it. Maybe not. But it was there. A quiet record of a man who stood his ground and still found space for tenderness. A week later, Sam brought his kids up to the cabin for the first full weekend. He sent photos. One of his daughters catching a fish almost too big for her to hold. Another of his sons sitting cross-legged on the dock, head tilted to the sky like he was listening to the world breathe. Sam didn't add captions. He didn't need to. The pictures spoke for themselves. Legacy was never about land. It was about care, stewardship, presence. And in those snapshots, I saw a continuation of something I thought I'd buried with Marianne. It wasn't over. It had just passed hands. Then, one afternoon, a card arrived in the mail. No return address. No message inside. Just a single line, written in Elise's handwriting. I remember the porch swing too. I read it 3 times before setting it on the mantel beside the photo. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a truce. But it was something. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the story hadn't ended. It had just changed chapters. I didn't call her. I didn't write back. Instead, I went out to the garden, knelt beside the soil Marianne once loved, and whispered, "We're okay." Because in that moment, I knew we were. I didn't get a reconciliation. I didn't get understanding. But I got something better. Peace. And I learned that peace isn't loud or glorious. It's quiet, steady, and earned in the silence after the storm. I stood by what mattered. And I will, for as long as I breathe. Some choices don't come wrapped in forgiveness or applause. They just come with clarity. If you've ever had to make a hard choice for the sake of your own peace, even when it cost you connection, this story was for you. Tell me in the comments if you have ever been forced to choose between legacy and loyalty. I'd love to hear your side. And if these stories resonate with you, stick around. There's more where this came from. See you soon in the next story.